I remember the day Alice said yes as if it happened just yesterday. It was the kind of moment that felt like the climax of every romantic movie I'd ever seen. A feeling of pure, unfiltered joy. I had found the love of my life, and we were about to start a future together. Our relationship seemed flawless, too perfect, perhaps. Friends admired what we had, and our families were buzzing with excitement about the wedding. I couldn't wait to marry Alice and build the life I had always dreamed of with her. But then, just a few months before the wedding, everything started to change. It was an ordinary Thursday evening. I was at home, casually scrolling through honeymoon ideas on my laptop. Alice was out, as usual, for a late work meeting, or so she said. As I mulled over beach destinations versus a European tour, Alice's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. It wasn't the first time she'd left it lying around, and normally, I wouldn't have given it a second thought. We had never been the kind of couple who hid things from each other. But this time was different. The message preview flashed on the screen, and I happened to catch it out of the corner of my eye. It was from someone named Matt. The preview read, "Can't wait to see you tonight." I felt a strange sensation, a mix of dread and curiosity, that made me pick up the phone. I hesitated for a moment, reminding myself that we trusted each other, that there was no reason to doubt her. But I couldn't resist. I unlocked the phone and scrolled through the recent notifications. The more I looked, the more unsettled I became. There were messages from Matt, but also from two other names, Sean and Eric. None of the messages were overtly incriminating, but there was a familiarity to them that didn't sit right with me. There was talk of meeting up, casual jokes, inside references I didn't recognize. It didn't feel like just friendly chatter. My stomach tightened as I placed the phone back down, pretending as if nothing had happened. That night, when Alice came home, she was her usual cheerful self, chatting about how the meeting had gone longer than expected and how she'd grabbed a quick dinner on the way back. I wanted to believe her, to brush aside the doubts that had suddenly started creeping in. But the more I tried to act normal, the more I noticed little things I had been overlooking. Her phone was now always on silent. She was texting more than usual, even when we were together. And there was a distracted look in her eyes, like she was only half listening whenever I spoke. That night I lay awake long after Alice had drifted off to sleep. As I stared at the ceiling, I felt a knot of unease tightening inside me. I didn't know if I was being paranoid, or if there was truly something going on, but I knew I had to find out. I had to know if the person I was about to marry was hiding something from me. The day after discovering those messages, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe I had overreacted, misread the situation. Alice had never given me a reason not to trust her before. But despite all the rationalizations I made, a nagging feeling kept gnawing at me. I tried to shake it off, but every time her phone buzzed, every time she mentioned work, the doubt crept back in. The changes in Alice's behavior were subtle at first. Small things that I convinced myself didn't mean much. She began spending more evenings at the office, and her explanations grew increasingly vague. "It's just a busy season," she'd say casually, or, "I have to stay late to meet this deadline." She was always on her phone, not just texting but guarding it like a precious secret. It was never left lying around like before, and if I walked into the room while she was using it, she would put it away quickly, as though she didn't want me to see. Then there were the sudden plans, last-minute dinners with friends I'd never heard of, spontaneous yoga classes across town, errands that took far longer than they should have. The signs were there, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't quite fit together. And yet, I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was just stressed because of the upcoming wedding. But I knew deep down, something was off. Determined to find the truth, I decided to keep a closer eye on her movements. Whenever Alice was working late, I'd discreetly check her location through the app we used to share our whereabouts. It wasn't about spying. I told myself it was about protecting my future. I needed reassurance that the woman I was about to marry was still the same person I had fallen in love with. It didn't take long for a pattern to emerge. Alice wasn't just at the office late at night. Her phone was frequently pinging from a few specific locations: the same coffee shop, a yoga studio across town, and a nearby park. Places she had never mentioned before, places that made little sense given her explanations. One night, she told me she was going to meet an old friend for dinner. Something in her voice sounded rehearsed, like she was trying too hard to sound casual. I decided to see for myself. I drove by the restaurant she said she was going to, just to put my mind at ease. But when I arrived, there was no sign of Alice. I circled the block a few times, even parked for a while, but she never showed up. Frustrated and feeling more suspicious than ever, I decided to swing by the coffee shop I had noticed on her location history. It was a long shot, but I had to know. As I pulled up, I saw her sitting at an outdoor table with a man. They were talking, their heads close together, and she was laughing a kind of carefree laugh I hadn't heard in months. I felt my stomach drop when I recognized him. It was Sean, her coworker, the same Sean who had been sending her messages. I didn't confront them. Instead, I drove away, feeling like my world was starting to tilt on its axis. Alice came home later that night with a cheerful story about her friend's new job and how they had spent hours catching up. I wanted to believe her, but the image of her with Sean kept playing in my mind. Over the next few days, I kept my suspicions to myself and continued tracking her movements. It became a routine. I would note where she was and for how long, and soon enough, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together. Each location told a different story. Her regular visits to the coffee shop with Sean, the yoga studio where she met someone named Matt, and the park where she often spent time with Eric, her college friend. It was becoming clear that there were 3 different men in her life, and none of them knew about the others. The realization hit me like a tidal wave. The woman I was about to marry was living a double life, or perhaps even a triple one. I had to know more. I had to understand why Alice was doing this and what it meant for us. But more than anything, I needed proof. Proof that I wasn't just imagining things. Proof that I wasn't losing my mind. After seeing Alice with Sean, there was no turning back. I couldn't pretend everything was fine, but I wasn't ready to confront her just yet. I needed to gather more information to understand how deep this betrayal ran. If I was going to unravel the truth, I had to be methodical about it. I began by researching each man she was involved with, starting with Sean. Sean was a co-worker of Alice's, someone she had mentioned in passing over the years. He was the kind of guy who seemed charming and easygoing, always willing to lend a hand. I scoured his social media profiles, looking for any clues, but everything he posted seemed perfectly normal pictures from work events, outings with friends, nothing out of the ordinary. But when I dug a little deeper, I found photos of him at the same places Alice had been frequenting: the coffee shop, the park. It was subtle, but the evidence was there, hidden in plain sight. Then, I turned my attention to Matt. He was the yoga instructor at a studio Alice had joined a few months ago, shortly after we got engaged. I had thought nothing of it at the time. She said yoga was helping her relieve stress. But now, it seemed like more than just a hobby. I drove by the studio on several occasions when I knew she'd be there. Sometimes, I would see her leaving with Matt, their conversations looking too comfortable for my liking. One evening, I saw them standing by her car, talking closely. The way he touched her shoulder when he laughed told me everything I needed to know. Finally, there was Eric. I remembered meeting him once at a college reunion event Alice and I had attended a few years back. He was charming, with that kind of laid-back personality that made him easy to talk to. They had stayed friends over the years, occasionally catching up over lunch or coffee. But now, her visits with Eric were happening more frequently, and always in the same secluded area of the park. I parked at a distance one afternoon and watched as they sat on a bench, talking like they were the only 2 people in the world. She leaned into him, her hand resting on his arm, and I felt my blood boil. The deeper I dug, the clearer the picture became. It was as if Alice had divided her life into separate compartments, with each man serving a distinct purpose. Sean was her confidant, the one who provided emotional support when she needed someone to talk to about work stress or her personal life. Their relationship was built on shared secrets and late-night conversations that should have been shared with me. With Matt, it was something else entirely. He offered a sense of physical attraction and excitement, a way for Alice to feel desirable and adventurous. And Eric was the reminder of a simpler time, a link to her carefree college days that seemed to represent an escape from the pressures of adulthood. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how thoroughly Alice had deceived not only me, but each of these men as well. None of them knew about each other. In their minds, Each of them was special to Alice in a way that was unique and exclusive. Sean thought he was her closest confidant, the one who knew her heart better than anyone. Matt clearly believed he was the one who made her feel alive and attractive, while Eric seemed convinced that he was her connection to a past she longed to relive. It hit me like a punch to the gut. She had lied to all of us. It wasn't just about the affairs. It was about the extent of the deception, the way she had maintained separate relationships without any of us suspecting a thing. I began to doubt everything I thought I knew about Alice, wondering how much of our relationship was real and how much was just another compartment in her life. The wedding plans, the long talks about our future, the times we laughed together, it all felt tainted now, as if I had been living in a fantasy of my own making. I even reached out to Sean and Eric under the guise of a mutual friend, trying to gather more information. I found ways to steer the conversation toward Alice without raising any suspicions. Both of them spoke highly of her, describing her as a kind, genuine person. The irony wasn't lost on me. To them, she was a remarkable woman, the kind of person who enriched their lives. To me, she was starting to look like a stranger. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to confront Alice. I felt like I was in too deep, like there was more to uncover before I could make sense of it all. I kept watching, gathering evidence, making notes of dates and locations. I had to know how long this had been going on, what had led her down this path, and if there was any part of her that was still true to the woman I had fallen in love with. But the more I watched, the more painful it became. I was torturing myself, digging into details that tore at my heart with each new revelation. I would replay the moments in my head, seeing her with Sean at the coffee shop, noticing the way Matt's hand lingered on her arm, the comfort in her laugh when she was with Eric. It was like reliving the betrayal over and over, as if I was trying to make sense of something that was fundamentally senseless. Yet, I couldn't stop. I had to know how far it went, how much of our relationship was a lie. And most importantly, I needed to decide what I was going to do about it. By the time I had pieced together enough evidence, I knew a confrontation was inevitable. But it wasn't enough for me to simply talk to Alice behind closed doors. I needed to do something that would force the truth into the open. The other men deserved to know what was really going on, just as much as I needed confirmation that I wasn't losing my mind. I decided to set up a meeting where all four of us, Alice, Sean, Matt, Eric, and myself, would be in the same place at the same time. It was a risky move, but I was desperate for answers, and I wanted them all to see the truth for themselves. I started by gaining access to Alice's phone again, waiting for the perfect opportunity when she was in the shower. With my heart pounding, I went through her contacts and sent each of the men a message from her number, inviting them to a special dinner at a restaurant we often visited. I crafted each message carefully, making sure it sounded like something Alice would write, just vague enough to pique their curiosity, but with enough familiarity to ensure they would show up. I told them it would be an intimate gathering, something she had been planning for a while, and that she had something important to discuss. The bait was set. The day of the dinner, I arrived at the restaurant early, positioning myself at a table near the back where I could observe without being seen. My pulse was racing as I sat there, waiting. One by one, the men started to arrive. First came Sean, glancing around the room with a look of mild confusion as he checked his phone. He was followed shortly by Matt, who entered with a casual stride, clearly not expecting anything unusual. Lastly, Eric walked in, looking as though he had dressed for a special occasion. Each of them was directed to the same table by the hostess. I watched as they exchanged polite but puzzled greetings, probably wondering why Alice had asked them all to be here at the same time. A few minutes passed, and the atmosphere grew increasingly awkward as they waited. Then Alice walked in. The look on her face when she saw the three men sitting together was one I will never forget. Her expression went from confusion to shock, then quickly shifted to something else, panic, perhaps. She froze in the doorway for a moment, as though her mind was trying to catch up with what her eyes were seeing. That's when I stepped out from my corner and approached the table. Surprised. "Alice?" I asked, my voice as calm as I could manage, despite the adrenaline surging through me. She looked at me with wide eyes, then at the three men who were now staring at her, each with their own mix of confusion and suspicion. "Adam, what is this?" she stammered, her face going pale. She glanced back at the men, as if expecting one of them to provide an explanation that could make this all make sense. "I think you owe us all an explanation," I said, folding my arms and looking directly at her. "Why did you think it was okay to lead 3 different lives? Why are you playing games with all of us?" The silence that followed was almost deafening. Alice opened her mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. She looked at each of the men, who were now exchanging looks of disbelief and hurt, trying to process what was happening. I could see the anger start to rise in Sean's eyes, the disappointment on Eric's face, and the way Matt's jaw tightened as if he was forcing himself to stay composed. Alice finally found her voice. I don't know what you're talking about," she said, a weak attempt at denial. But the truth was written all over her face, and we all saw it. "This is just a misunderstanding," she continued, her voice shaky. "A misunderstanding?" I echoed, my tone sharper than I intended. "You've been seeing Sean, Matt, and Eric behind each other's backs and mine. I know about the coffee shop, the yoga classes, the park meetings. I know everything." Her face turned crimson as the reality of the situation sank in. There was no way out of this. The truth was out in the open, and there was no denying it anymore. Alice's eyes darted around, as if searching for a way to escape, but there was nowhere to go. The other men's reactions began to unfold. Sean was the first to speak, his voice laced with anger. "Alice, what the hell is going on? You told me you were unhappy because of work, that you needed time away. Was that just a lie?" Matt's expression was one of cold realization. "I thought I was helping you feel alive again," he said quietly. "Guess I was just one part of your act." Eric didn't say anything. He just stared at Alice, his face betraying the sadness of someone who had been blindsided. The air was thick with the weight of betrayal, and there was nothing Alice could say that would make it go away. The confrontation was not only painful for me, but for all of us. Alice's carefully crafted web of lies was unraveling, and there was no way she could mend it now. As she stood there, caught in the middle of the mess she had created, I knew that whatever came next, it wouldn't involve me standing by her side anymore. As the tension continued to thicken around the table, Alice's eyes darted from one man to the next. The panic was clear, and I could see her mind racing to find an explanation that might make this all go away. But I wasn't going to give her an easy out. This confrontation was as much about closure for me as it was about exposing her betrayal. "Come on, Alice," I said, my voice colder now. "Tell them. Tell us all why you thought it was okay to lead 3 separate lives. Why you made us all believe we were the only ones." I glanced at Sean, Matt, and Eric. Their expressions showed varying degrees of disbelief, anger, and hurt. They were waiting, just like I was, for an answer that would never be enough. She took a shaky breath and began to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said, her eyes glassy. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was just lost." "Lost?" Sean shot back, anger flaring in his eyes. "You strung us all along and lied to our faces. Was that your idea of finding yourself?" His voice echoed with frustration, and I could see the hurt beginning to transform into rage. "I didn't know how to handle the pressure," she continued, her voice faltering. "The engagement. It just felt like everything was closing in on me. I thought that if I kept these relationships separate, I could figure out who I was. I didn't know how to talk to Adam about my doubts. I couldn't hold back anymore." "You didn't know how to talk to me?" I asked, my tone sharp and bitter. "You didn't think I deserved the truth, but you had no problem sharing yourself with these other men?" The words tasted bitter in my mouth, but I was holding back something else, something that had been festering inside me since I discovered the truth about Alice's affairs. "You know, Alice," I said, a sudden calmness settling over me, "I wasn't the same fool you thought I was." She looked at me, confusion and fear mixing on her face. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. I glanced around at the 3 other men before locking eyes with Alice again. "After I found out about your little secrets, I decided I'd get a taste of revenge," I confessed, keeping my tone steady. "I met someone, a girl I knew from before we got together. She was beautiful, smart, and more importantly, she was there when I needed someone." I saw Alice's eyes widen as the implications sank in. I'm not proud of it, I continued. But I wasn't going to let you have the last laugh while you carried on with these guys. It wasn't just about the physical aspect, it was about taking back control, about not letting you make me feel small. There was a moment of stunned silence around the table. Sean, Matt, and Eric exchanged glances, while Alice sat there, visibly shaken. I didn't feel any sense of victory in telling her, but it was the truth, and I wanted her to know that I wasn't the passive victim she thought I was. So, I guess you're not the only one who's been living a double life, I added. But at least I wasn't pretending to plan a future with someone while sneaking around behind their back. Alice's expression collapsed into a mixture of disbelief and sorrow. Adam, how could you? She whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. How could I? I repeated, almost laughing at the absurdity of her question. You've got some nerve, Alice. I found out you were lying to me for months, maybe even years, and now you're surprised that I didn't just sit around and wait for you to come clean? The other men were silent, unsure how to react to this new twist. The betrayal ran deeper than they had initially thought, but now it was clear that this wasn't just about Alice's deceit, it was also about how far the consequences of her actions had spread. Sean stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This is unbelievable, he muttered, shaking his head. I'm out. Without another word, he walked out of the restaurant, leaving the rest of us to the wreckage. Matt's face was a mask of disgust, though whether it was directed at Alice, at me, or at the situation as a whole, I couldn't tell. You said I made you feel alive, he said to Alice, his voice cold and detached. Well, I don't feel anything anymore. He turned and walked out, not sparing her another glance. Eric lingered, his gaze shifting between Alice and me. I don't even know what to say, he murmured, his voice heavy with resignation. I thought you were better than this, Alice. I really did. With that, he walked away, leaving Alice and me alone. She looked up at me, the tears now flowing freely. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice breaking. I never wanted it to end like this. I shook my head slowly. It didn't have to end like this, I replied. But you made your choices and I made mine. There was no need for more words. I had said everything I needed to say, and hearing her apology didn't change anything. I turned and walked out of the restaurant without looking back. The confrontation had given me some closure, but it had also left me with the realization that revenge hadn't brought the satisfaction I thought it would. It didn't undo the betrayal or erase the hurt, but it did make one thing clear. I was done living in the shadow of her lies, and I was finally ready to move on. After the confrontation, Alice and I were left alone at the table. The restaurant seemed to echo with an uncomfortable silence, as if even the walls knew there was nothing left to say. She sat across from me, her face a picture of exhaustion and defeat. It was the first time in weeks I had seen her facade crack completely, revealing the turmoil underneath. Adam, she began, her voice trembling. Please, just let me explain. There was a desperation in her tone that would have moved me once, but now, it just felt hollow. Explain what, Alice? I replied, my voice cold. You've already admitted everything. You were unhappy, you were scared, you were trying to fill some kind of void. You didn't think to come to me about it, you just went out and found other people to make you feel whole. I shook my head, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. What more is there to say? She looked down at her hands, fidgeting with a napkin as though it held the answers. It wasn't that I didn't love you, she said softly. I just started doubting if I could be the person you needed. I didn't know how to tell you that I wasn't ready for marriage. I felt like I was losing myself, and I panicked. I stared at her, struggling to understand. So, you didn't think I deserved to know that? You didn't think I deserved a chance to work through it with you? The frustration was building up inside me again, and I had to clench my fists to keep it from spilling over. I didn't know how to be honest with you, she confessed, tears finally spilling down her cheeks. I thought that if I kept everyone in separate parts of my life, I could somehow make it all work, that I wouldn't have to choose, or face the reality that I was a coward. Her voice broke on that last word, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the woman I had fallen in love with, someone flawed and scared, but real. But the damage was done. I couldn't unsee the truth now. I couldn't just forgive and forget because she was finally admitting to her mistakes. You had 3 men, I said quietly, trying to keep the bitterness from creeping into my tone. 3 different relationships you maintained while planning a life with me. That wasn't just fear, Alice. That was betrayal. She wiped her eyes, nodding as if the weight of my words had finally sunk in. You're right, she whispered. It was betrayal. And I'm so sorry, Adam. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I need you to know that I'm not proud of what I did. I'm ashamed of it. The apology fell flat. It was too late for regret to mean anything to me. I loved you, I said, my voice faltering as the truth of it hit me all over again. I would have done anything to make things right, but you didn't give me that chance. You just left me out of your life, even when I was right there with you. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy, filled with everything that had been left unsaid between us. Alice seemed to be searching for some way to fix the shattered pieces of our relationship, but I knew it was beyond repair. It wasn't just that she had betrayed me, it was that she had chosen to live a lie, day after day, and let me believe in a future that was never real. You need to figure out who you really are, I said finally, my tone resigned. But you're going to have to do it without me. I can't keep pretending that what we had was real. Alice nodded slowly, as if she had known all along that this was how it would end. I understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible. I'm so sorry. I stood up from the table, feeling an emptiness where there should have been anger or sadness or anything. But all I felt was relief. Not because I was happy to walk away, but because the truth, however painful, had finally set me free. Without looking back, I walked out of the restaurant, leaving Alice sitting there alone. I didn't know where I was headed, but I knew I was done living in the shadows of her lies. It was time to start finding myself again, without her. Walking out of the restaurant felt like stepping into a different world. The air was cold against my skin, but it was refreshing, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere I had just left behind. As I drove away, I felt a strange sense of calm settling over me, a calm I hadn't known in a long time. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was the beginning of something new. The truth was out. I was free from Alice's deception, even if I didn't yet know what that freedom really meant. In the days that followed, I moved out of the apartment we had shared. Packing my things was harder than I thought it would be. So many memories were attached to that place. Every corner of it seemed to remind me of the life we had been planning together, the life that now felt like a cruel illusion. I found old photos, mementos from vacations, and even the wedding invitations we had just started addressing. I tossed the invitations into the trash and left the photos in a drawer, not knowing what else to do with them. I wasn't ready to look at them, but I wasn't ready to destroy them either. Friends and family reached out, offering their sympathy and support. It was comforting to know that I wasn't alone, even if I didn't always feel like talking about what had happened. I tried to explain the situation to my closest friends without going into too much detail, but I could see the shock in their eyes. Nobody had seen this coming. We were the perfect couple, as they had always said, the ones who seemed to have it all figured out. I was embarrassed that I hadn't noticed the cracks sooner, ashamed that I had been fooled so completely, but I knew that wallowing in self-pity wouldn't help me heal. I needed to rebuild my life, to find a new normal that didn't involve Alice or the future we had imagined together. I threw myself into work, taking on extra projects and spending late nights at the office. The distractions helped. They kept my mind from drifting back to the what-ifs and the if-onlys. I started working out again, something I had neglected during the whirlwind of wedding planning. The physical exertion was therapeutic, a way to release some of the anger and frustration that still simmered inside me. Yoga was something I never thought I'd try, but I figured I could use all the help I could get to find some peace. I signed up for a class at the very same studio Alice had attended. At first, it felt strange, almost like I was intruding on a part of her life that I didn't belong to. But as I went to more classes, I began to see it differently. The yoga sessions weren't about her anymore, they were about me. It was my space now, a place where I could reconnect with myself and quiet the chaos in my mind. Gradually, I started to feel more centered, more in control of my own story. Outside of work and yoga, I began reconnecting with old friends, people I hadn't spent much time with in the past few years. I started saying yes to invitations again, dinners, weekend getaways, even just casual meetups for drinks. It was good to be around familiar faces, to laugh again without it feeling forced. I realized how much of myself I had lost during my relationship with Alice, how many aspects of my life I had neglected because I was so focused on building a future with her. Now, I had a chance to reclaim those parts of myself. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. There were days when the grief would hit me like a tidal wave, out of nowhere. Sometimes, I'd find myself staring at a photo of us, wondering how things had gone so wrong, or replaying the confrontation in my mind, wishing I had said something different. Other times, I'd wake up in the middle of the night, expecting to find Alice lying next to me, only to be reminded that she wasn't there. The emptiness was a constant companion, one I was learning to live with, but I still had a long way to go. The hardest part was letting go of the anger. I was angry at Alice for betraying me, at the other men for unknowingly being part of the deception, and at myself for not seeing it sooner. But I knew that if I didn't find a way to release that anger, it would keep me stuck in the past. So, little by little, I worked on forgiving, not forgetting, but forgiving. I didn't forgive Alice to absolve her of what she had done. I did it to free myself from the bitterness that threatened to consume me. As the months went by, I found myself thinking less about Alice and more about the life I was rebuilding. I even started dating again, cautiously at first, unsure if I was ready to open up to someone new. It wasn't easy. I had trust issues now, and I was more guarded than I had ever been before. But I was determined not to let one person's betrayal define how I saw the world or how I approached relationships. I owed it to myself to keep moving forward, to believe that there was still good in people, even if it took time to find it. I wasn't the same person I had been before the betrayal, but maybe that was okay. I was stronger now, more aware of my own worth and my own needs. I had learned to put myself first, to prioritize my own happiness rather than bending over backward to make someone else's dreams come true. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I was in control of my own life again. It wasn't about forgetting the past, it was about finding a way to move beyond it. And I was finally ready to do just that. Months had passed since the confrontation, and life had finally settled into a new rhythm. The pain of betrayal wasn't gone, but it had dulled, fading into the background like a scar that no longer hurt to touch. I had rebuilt my life piece by piece, and while it was different from the one I had envisioned with Alice, it felt more authentic. I was living for myself now, making choices based on what I wanted, not what I thought I should do. One afternoon, I ran into Alice by chance at a local park. She looked different, older, maybe, or just more worn down. There was a sadness in her eyes that hadn't been there before, a reflection of the consequences of her choices. We exchanged a few polite words, and she apologized again, saying that she had taken time to reflect and was working on finding herself. I listened quietly, not feeling anger or pity, just a calm acceptance. Her journey was her own, and I had already moved on from it. As I walked away, I realized how much had changed. I didn't feel the bitterness I had once harbored, nor did I dwell on what could have been. That chapter of my life had closed, and I was grateful for the lessons it had taught me. The betrayal had forced me to confront my own needs, my own desires, and had ultimately set me on a path of self-discovery. Standing there in the park, I took a deep breath and felt the weight of the past finally lift. I was no longer defined by the pain or by the lies. I was free to write my own story, one day at a time. As I walked forward, I embraced the uncertainty of the future with open arms, knowing that I was stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever came next.